Everyone, this is the real start now. Yeah. Yay. All right. Good morning and welcome. So I'm Joyce LeMay, and I'm the chair of the Department of Business and Economics, and we are thrilled to have you all here today for our exciting conversation. So I want to thank two professors in particular that really helped pull this together, and that's Professor Dean Junkins and also Professor Amanda Carter. So thanks to the two of them for putting this all together. All right, so we have two speakers with us today, so I'm going to introduce both of them, and then I'm going to pass it over for them. So first of all, we have Tim Essenberg, and many of you know him very well. He's the professor of economics in the Department of Business and Economics. He's taught for us for 27 years, all right? So it's been a long, great time. He teaches a variety of economics courses. One key course he teaches is intermediate macroeconomics, which many of you have had, right? Yes. All right. Starting fall of 2009, he's used the Great Recession as a case study to challenge the dominant view that the financial markets behave according to the efficient market hypothesis, which says that all market participants are rational and that the future is best understood as risky. Well, instead, he focuses on behavioral economics and uncertainty to better help us understand a money entrepreneurial market economy. We also have Neel Kashkari with us today, which we're thrilled to have him here. He took office January 1st, 2016 as the 13th President and Chief Executive Officer of the 9th District Federal Reserve Bank at Minneapolis. In 2016, he serves as an alternative voting member of the Federal Open Market Committee. Mr. Kashkari was born on July 30th, 1973 in Akron, Ohio. He has a bachelor's and a master's degree in mechanical engineering, both from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Before taking office at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, Mr. Kashkari was managing director and member of the executive office at PIMCO. In January 2013, he resigned from the firm to explore a run for public office. In 2014, he announced his candidacy for governor of California. Prior to joining PIMCO in 2009, Mr. Kashkari served in the U.S. Department of the Treasury from 2006 to 2009, first as a senior advisor to Secretary Henry Paulson, and then as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. In the latter role, he established and led the Office of Financial Stability and oversaw the Troubled Assets Relief Program, known as TARP, for both President George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Before joining the Treasury Department, Mr. Kashkari was vice president at Goldman Sachs in San Francisco. Previously, he was an aerospace engineer at TRW Corporation. Yes, that's a lot of great things. Wow. And the good news is, you're all starting your careers. So we don't know where you're going to be in a few years. So how fun, it's great to know that. So we are off to a wonderful hour conversation, and so I am going to pass this conversation to Professor Tim Essenberg and to Mr. Neel Kashkari.
I too want to welcome you to the Q&A session that we have, and that's going to be the format. And so I have some questions for the president of the Fed here. We'll go through those, and then I had indicated to him that we would have about 15 minutes at the end for questions from the audience, and he suggested that I expand that time. So I decided to listen to him, and there'll probably be more like 20 minutes or something like this at the end. Of course, I want to get my questions in, but there will be time for the questions that you have. So as we interact, if you come up with a question or a follow-up question, jot this down. When it's open for the audience, we have a mic up here and a mic over here, and if you would just line up, I'll rotate this way on a first-come, first-served basis, unless some of you say your question is so great you need to get to the front of the line. We'll have to vet that, but this is the way we're going to do this. So we're going to start out here with questions more of a personal nature, just to let us know. And I'm wondering if you would share with us a little bit about your upbringing, and then specifically why did you switch from engineering to finance? You went from the productive side of the economy to just making money go around.
Exactly.
Just wonder why you did this.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. And please, everybody call me Neel. I was born in Ohio. My parents came here from India about 50 years ago. I was a middle-class kid. My dad taught engineering at the local college. My mom was a doctor at the local hospital. And when I was growing up, the question was, am I going to be a doctor or an engineer? And I liked math and science, and I liked building things, so engineering seemed like a good fit. I studied engineering, really enjoyed it, decided to go into aerospace engineering because I wanted to go after the biggest technical challenges I could get my hands on. And for me, that was designing satellites for NASA. And so I worked for a government contractor that was developing technology for NASA, and I loved it. I was deep in research and development. But the path before me, my managers were encouraging me to go get my PhD. And so I had to make a choice. Either I would get my PhD, in which case I'd probably spend the next 15 or 20 years doing research, or learn about something new. And I didn't know anything about business or finance, so I said, let me go get my MBA, learn about finance, learn about accounting, learn about business, and see where that leads me. And so that's why I went to Wharton to get my MBA, and then that led me to investment banking, where I joined Goldman in San Francisco, where I was working with technology companies, helping them on IPOs and mergers. The idea was to try to combine engineering and business, and working with tech companies seemed like a way to do that. Truth is, I didn't use very much engineering in that, but it was still interesting.
All right. You seem to have a keen interest in public service. So you're with TARP in the Treasury for a while, then you were in California, ran for governor, and now you're the president of the Fed here in Minneapolis. I wonder if you just comment on the sort of private, public aspects of your work.
Sure. So I've had an interest in public policy and public service. I mean, honestly, since I was a kid, I remember watching the Sunday morning talk shows with my dad when I was in elementary school, and I was just fascinated by Washington. And when I was at Goldman, I was there for 4 years out of business school, and the CEO of my firm got picked to become Treasury Secretary, a man named Henry Paulson. President Bush picked him to be Treasury Secretary. And I'd met him once for 10 minutes, so I basically cold called him, and I said, you probably don't remember me. We met. I want to come with you. I don't care if I'm going to lick envelopes. I just want to come and serve. And by the grace of God, he made a few calls. He checked me out, and I started with him the same day he started at Treasury. Now, my title was very fancy. It sounded very exotic. I was Senior Advisor to the Treasury Secretary, which sounded very, very cool. The reality was I was an aide to the Treasury Secretary, and I just needed to do whatever he needed to get done. But it was a great opportunity for me to learn how government works, learn about public policy, and I worked really hard. I earned his trust, earned his respect, and when the financial crisis hit a couple of years later, I was right there in the middle of it with him, and ultimately got promoted, became an Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, and then ran the bailout program, the TARP program, which many of you have probably heard about.
Right. So one thing I've noticed about you is you have a kind of a type of intensity about you, and a communication style that would play well in Chicago and New York. But you're in Minneapolis. I'm wondering how that's going.
Well, you tell me. I mean, it seems like so far I haven't gotten any negative feedback on my communication style in Minnesota, but maybe I am now.
No, I'm with you. I'm with you on your communication style.
Look, I try to communicate in a way that people can understand. And I'll give you an example. So a few Fed chairmen ago, there was a Fed chair named Alan Greenspan. You've probably heard about him or read about him. He would go up and testify before Congress, and you couldn't make heads or tails out of what he was saying. It was so confusing. And it was, I watched him, and it would be intimidating for me and for everyone else. It was like, wow, this man must be brilliant, because he's speaking in ways we can't follow him. Well, he was doing that on purpose. And he did that to try to say, hey, you can't understand what we're doing, just leave us alone. That's not the right thing, because that didn't earn the trust of the people. And when the crisis hit, and now all of a sudden we needed the people to trust us, we hadn't built that trust. So I work really hard to try to communicate in a way that everybody can understand, and I try to simplify sometimes very complicated topics, and then become more accessible to people and just be blunt. And I don't have anything to hide. I'll tell you the truth. So I always ask audiences, and I'm going to ask you today, do me a favor and ask me your toughest question. I mean that, because if you're thinking of a tough question, there's probably a good chance someone else in the audience is thinking of the same question. And I would much rather get that out in the open and give me a chance to answer it, rather than have some of you leave wondering, hey, what's the answer to my tough question? And so to me, maximum transparency, I'll be open and honest. If I don't know the answer, I'll tell you I don't know the answer. This is how you build trust with people. And so I'm hoping that we can do a lot better than we've done in the past.
And I'll substantiate that. I've heard him talk a number of times, a little bit at the latest symposium at the Fed, and he very much likes transparency and sort of getting to the point. So that'll be good when we hit there. I think you're probably the first Minneapolis Fed chair to visit with community leaders of color in communities that aren't doing well economically. So for example, you've met on the north side of Minneapolis with African American community leaders. You met on the south side of Minneapolis, actually in the neighborhood where I live, with Native American community leaders. And typically I would think that the Fed's major role involved in communities that aren't doing well economically is some level of enforcing the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, but not really anything else, right? So I have a couple of questions here to ask you that kind of play on. Are you sort of indicating that the Fed maybe should have a little bit larger role? So the first question is that, do you think the Fed should be directly involved in communities that aren't doing well economically? And if so, what exactly should the Fed do?
Well, let's go back. So Congress created the Fed and gave us what we call a dual mandate. We have two objectives that we are trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve stable prices, so basically an economy that's not running too hot or too cold, stable prices, and maximum employment. And so to me, understanding what does maximum employment mean? We all know, if you're all studying economics, we can't drive the unemployment rate to zero. There will always be some people who are in transition. So there's some minimum level of unemployment. Maybe it's 4%, maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 6%. But understanding what does maximum employment mean? Now, so that's one area where it's very important for us to understand. A second area is understanding who's unemployed and what's causing their levels of unemployment. I'll give you an example. There's a curious problem in the US economy that's been with us for a long time. Black unemployment in America is almost always twice white unemployment. 1.8 is the official number, but call it twice. So if it's a booming economy and white unemployment is 4, there's a really good chance that black unemployment in America is going to be 8. If it's a recession and white unemployment is 7, black unemployment, you can be sure, will probably be around 14. We don't even know why that is. And so while we know that monetary policy, we cannot target it to specific communities, to specific neighborhoods, or specific ethnic groups, we do have a lot of smart economists at the Fed. And if we can unravel this riddle of why these different racial groups experience different employment outcomes, then maybe we can educate other policymakers like Congress and others that they can take actions to try to make sure that we have a level playing field for everyone. So again, I don't think the Fed can solve these problems with monetary policy, but I think we can do our part in helping to analyze them and understand them.
All right, so that sort of anticipates the next question that I was going to ask you. And recently in the Star Tribune, Adam Belz, who's a staff writer, quoted you as saying, there's something structural in the US economy, as you indicated, in good and bad times, about twice unemployment. So when I think, we have the idea of structural unemployment as economists and finance people, but when I hear structural, actually I hear sociology. And I'm wondering if you would comment on that. There's what we say is structural unemployment, but to me, to make sense of that structural gap, we have to start thinking about sociology as it sort of plays out in the United States. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
I think that that's probably a component of it. I think there are sociological components of this that we need to understand. I know that the education is a component of this. Right. The fact of the matter is not everybody in America gets the same educational opportunity. When I think about myself, I have literally lived the American dream. Middle-class kid, son of immigrants, look what I've been able to achieve. Look at what I've been able to do. And this doesn't happen in any other country in the world. But the key to my own success was that my parents saw to it that I would get a good education. Because I got a good education, every door of our country's been open to me. And so part of it is going to be education policy to make sure everybody in America gets a high-quality education. And then there are going to be sociological factors. There are going to be discrimination elements to this as well. There are going to be cultural elements as well. One of the things that I learned in my visit with Native American families I couldn't believe this. I mean, this really just hit me like a ton of bricks. We were going around the room talking to Native American community leaders, and one of the women who was there was a Native American teacher, and she's taught in the Minneapolis public schools for about 20 years, focusing on Native American kids. And Native American student performance is way far behind white student performance, and I think it's even far behind African American student performance. So they asked moms, Native American moms, and they said, what is your greatest dream for your child? And the number one answer was, my greatest dream for my child is that my child stay with me here in our community. I couldn't believe that. Any other group that I've ever met with, you ask the moms, what's your dream for your child? It's to get out of here. It's to go achieve better success than the parents have achieved, to go find, my parents, they left India, they left their culture, they just wanted themselves and their children to have better opportunities. And so culture plays a role too in how you show respect for that culture, but create the pathways to opportunity so that future generations are better off. Because somehow we have to break these multi-generational cycles of poverty. And culture plays a role. And we need to be honest about that.
I'm going to follow up with that because I've lived in East Phillips for 26 years. And one thing that I've sensed sort of intuitively, but also through reading, is that when we say culture plays a role, I understand how there are communities that know that the larger culture is going to marginalize them always. It has historically and likely will in the future. So that the most important thing is to, quote, know who you are as a person, a culturally person. Take an individual like myself, I don't really need to know that in the United States. I am a norm. I'm considered normal, regular, and so on. But when I did read that, I thought that was the most important part of the entire article. But I think I understand that. And I think maybe one of the things, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, is that when we educate children, we are not taking into consideration strong enough the cultural and racial milieu in which they grow up to ground them in who they are while you are learning A, B, C, D, arithmetic, math, calculus, physics, and so on.
But this is tough stuff.
Good.
And there's
I want your answer.
Right? There's no easy answer and there's no right answer. So I will speak from my own experience. I'm an American. My parents came here from India. I'm an American. And I do have, I do feel sympathies and I do feel some allegiance and some spirit with the mother country, so to speak. I've been back to India many, many times, but I am an American through and through. And so is that an unreasonable price for my success, that I have embraced the American culture? I don't think so. Now, that's a choice I've made. And so I look at our country and I say, if you're willing to study hard, to me, it's about a level playing field. If we can make sure that young people have an opportunity for a good education and you can get a good job, then it's up to you whether or not you choose to take advantage of those opportunities. But I don't think we're going to solve everything for everyone, and people have to make choices about what's most important to them. One of the things, I've traveled all around the country as I've pursued my passions and my interests in my career. I've made sacrifices in doing so, right? I keep moving, and all of a sudden you uproot your life and you move somewhere else. There are people I meet who say, no, I grew up, by the way, in Minnesota, this is very common, right? Mm-hmm. You grew up in the Twin Cities, you love the Twin Cities, you don't want to leave. That's great, that's wonderful, that's a choice for you to make. Now, you are going to be making some sacrifices in doing so. You may not have as many opportunities as you would have if the entire United States or the entire world, you were willing to go there. And so each of us needs to make choices that are right for ourselves. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that because it's a tough issue.
So have you experienced racism in the United States?
I have, in the sense that, especially when I was younger, I've had people make comments to me, but I've been confident enough to brush it off. And I'm like, I don't care what you say. I am who I am, and I'm going to make the decisions that are right for me. So if somebody says something that's, mean-spirited toward me, who cares? So, I have, not the way everybody has. Right? Other people have experienced it worse than I have. We're not a perfect country, but I say this, look at any other country in the world. This is the most inclusive, welcoming country in the history of the world. We are not perfect, but I wouldn't want to live anywhere else.
I'll let it go. No, I'm not going to let it go.
Don't let it go.
I take your experience as true for you. And one of the things that I think is important to distinguish is the immigrant experience is frequently different than the experience, and I'll say the immigrants of color experience is going to be different than, for example, African American people who've been here for hundreds of years, Native American Indian people hundreds of years, Mexican Americans about hundreds of years. And so there's generational marginalization that was legal, now not legal, sociological, that kind of thing. And it strikes me as it may be a very open country, but some of us experience it once we've been much more inclusive. Other of us are still living with sort of the vestiges of hundreds of years of marginalization.
I'm with you. I agree with that. That's absolutely true. It's very different if you choose to come here versus you have things imposed on you. No question about that. And my parents chose to come here, so our outlook is very different. At the same time, we have to do our part to help people break the cycle. Otherwise, we're just going to have perpetual poverty and perpetual marginalization. That's not good for anybody. So we have to somehow find a way to intervene to break the cycle. And when you do break the cycle, this is what's so powerful about this. Once you break the cycle for one of you or somebody who comes from a marginalized background, their future generations are all better off. You're not just breaking the cycle for that person. And so I keep coming back to education. That's why I'm happy to be here, because I do think education solves so many of these problems if we can see to it that people are able to get the education, and then the cycle's broken.
Most of us in the audience here, students, are taking majors from the business econ department. What's your advice for us who are out there? 21 years old, looking out at the future.
I would just say my own experience is that life is long and you can do lots of different things. So your first job is not your most important job. It's not the end of the world if you don't get the dream job right out of the gate. It's what you do with that job. People have asked me, should I spend time networking? True story, I've never spent any time networking. My biggest advice I give to people for your job is crush your job. Be the MVP so your manager says, wow, if there's an important project that comes in, I'm going to go to this person. I'm going to go to you. I'm going to pick you because I trust you. I know you're going to get it done. If you make yourself the MVP, meaning no matter what is given to you, you do it with a good attitude, you get it done, you do it well, you're going to get more responsibility. And the key to your success, if your future career success, is you want to be the person that gets more responsibility. That's what's going to open doors to you. And so there's no secret. It's not about, my humble advice, it's not about networking, it's not about who you know. It's do a great job. Take risks. Seek out real responsibility. And if you seek out responsibility and you deliver, you will get more responsibility. And then you're going to get more, and you're going to get more, and you're going to get more. And that'll open up doors. People, it's funny, because I'm now CEO of the bank, and we have 1,000 employees, and so I talk to people about their careers. People have never given me responsibility to do me a favor. When Hank Paulson picked me to run the TARP, he had no choice. He just didn't have a lot of people around that he could turn to that he trusted. And so he wasn't doing me a favor. I was doing him a favor. And I say that jokingly, but it's like, it's not that I need someone to look out for me and do me favors. No, do a great job. And it's going to be in their interest to invest in you because that's going to make them more effective and more successful.
I'm going to turn a little bit now to the Fed and Fed policy. So 2 weeks ago was the 4th symposium on Too Big to Fail, which you have made sort of the point of your first year at the Fed. And as I understand, in November, you're going to come out with a paper, recommendations, and so on. Wondering if you could tell us what you're thinking at this point and what response do you think you'll get from the Fed and maybe financial markets also?
Sure. So let me back up for a moment. When I joined the bank in February, I gave a major speech where I said, the biggest banks are still too big to fail. That we had this terrible crisis. The big banks got into trouble. They almost cratered the U.S. economy. We had to bail them out. Then regulations were passed to try to prevent that from happening again. In my assessment, it has not solved the problem. They're still too big to fail, and we should do something about it. Now, coming out of the financial crisis, we had this terrible recession. The legislators and policymakers at the time said, we don't want to do anything too dramatic because the economy's still rocky. So they basically said, let's keep the financial system the same way, and let's put some Band-Aids around it. And that's really what I think Dodd-Frank was. And they took the more extreme measures off the table, like break up the banks. Some people said, let's break up the banks. They said, no, it's too risky. Or let's put so much capital in the banks, they virtually can't fail. They said, no, that's too risky. Well, I'm saying now is the time for us to reconsider some of those bolder options. And so that's what we've been doing over the course of this year, bringing experts to Minneapolis from around the country, saying, let's look at those transformational solutions and ask, are they better? Should we redo what we've done? So my view is we do need to be much more aggressive than we have been. We need to act soon because societies forget the mistakes of the past. So we repeated a lot of the mistakes that led to the Great Depression. We repeated them leading to the Great Recession. And it's probably not going to be the same people. It's going to be our kids or our grandkids who repeat the mistakes. So the key is, how do we reform the financial system now so that future generations don't repeat our mistakes? So we are going to be coming up with our recommendation in the next month or two, and we're going to release to the public. And I hope that the public takes it very, very seriously. At the end of the day, the public, you need to make the call. You need to decide, have we done enough or should we do more? And there's nothing free. There's no free lunch here. Right? This is just like the risk of terrorism. Every one of you knows we cannot eliminate the risk of terrorism. We can't take it to zero. And with more law enforcement and more safety comes increased costs. Right? It's expensive to hire more police officers or National Guard or CIA agents, et cetera. So there's a safety and there's cost for that safety. Same thing in the financial system. So we're going to lay out some options. We're going to lay out some safety metrics, and we're going to lay out some costs, and then the public needs to decide.
I'd like to follow up on the public needs to decide, because I remember the first time I heard you say that, I think it was at the Fed a number of months ago, and I believe I was there with some Bethel students, and I leaned over to one of them and I said, basically, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And this is what I mean by that is, it seems inconceivable to me that our elected politicians that are more or less beholden to some very key special interest groups, including the banking industry, is sort of going to listen to the general public and how they put forth regulations. I don't see anything in our history to make me go along on the general public.
Oh, I totally disagree.
Okay, good.
I totally disagree. First of all, when the financial crisis hit, in 2 weeks from when we asked for the TARP authority, which is the authority to use taxpayer money to bail out banks, to 2 weeks later, Republicans and Democrats came together to pass that legislation, and most of them were putting their political careers on the line. Many of them did not get reelected because they cast that vote. So, first of all, our political system is deeply flawed. It's imperfect, but it can work. And it can work in lightning speed, as we saw there, number one. Number two, look at the anger in the country today. Both sides of the aisle, right? You've got the extremes of both parties that are really angry about a lot of the same things. And they are having their voices heard in this election, absolutely. And so you're right, the public is not going to know the details of a bank capital standard. They're not going to know the details of what shadow banking means. But they sure as heck are expressing themselves in terms of, hey, we're angry about what just happened. We don't want it to happen again. And you, member of Congress, we're going to hold you accountable on whether or not you've dealt with it. And if you haven't, we're going to put somebody else in here who has. And so I absolutely think that at the end of the day, the public needs to make the call. Look, think about 9/11. 9/11 was devastating. You all are probably too young to really remember it that closely. But it was devastating for the country in 2001. I was an MBA student when it happened. I had just been to New York a couple weeks earlier interviewing. It was devastating. The people spoke, and they said, hey, we want to take much more aggressive actions on homeland security. And remember, President Bush first came out and said, we don't need a Department of Homeland Security. That's just rearranging this government. The people said, absolutely not. We want more forceful action. Now, whether that was the right call, I don't know, but the people spoke through their elected representatives. And so I absolutely think that our democracy works and that the people's voices are heard. It's not a straight line, and it's not necessarily tomorrow, but the people are really important, and the voices do get expressed through our political system.
So let me push a little bit more on that. You're obviously going to come out with some recommendations in November. What's the probability that these recommendations are going to be listened to in the next 2 years?
Well, I think they're going to be listened to. I think it's a very high probability people will pay attention to them. Whether it leads current regulators to directly change what they're doing or new legislation, I don't know. I can't game it out. Sometimes things take a long time before they take a short time.
Okay.
You know, it's just the way our democracy works. I'll give you an example, which is think about the issue of gay marriage in America. As recently as 2008, the state of California, the people of the state of California passed an amendment, like a ballot measure, banning gay marriage in California in 2008. It's now basically legal in the country. So things take a long time. They move very slowly, no action, until all of a sudden they move, and things can change. And so if we don't try, then I can guarantee you nothing's going to change.
So in too big to fail, obviously as we regulate, maybe an argument could be made, I think it could be, that there will be costs in the private sector, both from borrowers and lenders of credit, capital. And so then we look at the regulating agencies, oversights, and if there's too big to fail in the private side, I'm wondering if the agencies can ever become too big to succeed.
The agencies being the regulators?
Yes.
Well, the regulators have to, in a sense, they're growing to respond to the complexity and the size of the banks. And so I don't know. The honest answer is I don't know. I think that the regulators' jobs are much easier if the banks are less complex and are smaller. And so you don't need brilliant regulators if the banks are simpler. And here's the thing, we can't legislate wisdom, right? If I go back to what caused the 2008 crisis, at its root, we had a nationwide delusion that home prices only go up. Because basically, for most of American history, home prices they were either flat or they went up. And so, boy, if that's been your experience, then you're like, well, I'm not taking very many risks. And the homeowners, the buyers of the homes didn't think they were taking risks. The lenders didn't think they were taking risks. The regulators, the rating agencies, they all believed home prices only go up. And so, it's tough. You can't legislate wisdom, and we all contributed to that crisis.
I want to pick up on your comment that the Fed has two mandates, and I want to pick up on the one that had to do with maximum employment. What does maximum employment look like today in terms of a rate, in terms of the fact that male labor force participation is down? How do we know, are we there right now? Is it a couple points below?
Yeah, so this is a really important and tough question. Most economists have believed that maximum employment, which is, if you go below maximum employment, the theory is that wages will start getting pushed up. That'll lead to inflation. And so you want the unemployment rate to be as low as possible so that it's not creating inflation, so that the economy's in balance. Well, the question is, what is that rate? And you think about the unemployment measures, the headline rate, which is 5% right now, is only accounting for people who are actively looking for jobs or who are actively working. Well, some people have left the labor force because they're discouraged and they're not in the numerator or the denominator. So they don't have a job and they're not looking, so in a sense they're not counted. Well, what's happened after the financial crisis is that population of workers that are no longer in the labor force ballooned. Now, a few years ago, most experts thought that we were going to have a lost generation of workers. People who were out of work for 6 months, a year, would become permanently unemployable and would just be lost. So we shouldn't even think about them, just focus on that headline rate. Well, that's very costly for them, and that's very costly for society to have millions of people out of work with no hope of ever coming back in. The good news is, as the economy is slowly healed, a lot of those workers that we thought were lost have started re-entering the labor force. That's a really good thing. So the headline unemployment rate has been stuck at 5%, even though the economy is creating more jobs. Why is it stuck? Workers are re-entering the labor force, so they're in the numerator and the denominator, and the ratio isn't moving. So the answer is, we don't know. My view is, let's let the economy keep creating jobs, bringing workers off the sidelines, so long as it's not creating inflation. And we are undershooting our inflation target. We've been undershooting it for 4 years. I don't see the urgency.
All right, that's a good segue to the next question, which is...
By the way, he has not shown me these questions.
No, it's, yeah, you don't. That makes it more enjoyable for all of us. So the Fed policy has been expansionary on all accounts for 8 years. And you alluded to, or you mentioned the idea that inflation doesn't seem to be a problem, so maybe we keep it where it is, right? That sounds a whole lot like Alan Greenspan, right? We're just worried about inflation, everything takes care of itself. So here's the question. The question is it possible that the current Fed policy, which has basically been in place, we haven't unwound our balance sheet, we've got short rates, only 25 basis points above where they were, all this stuff is, is this a fruitful area for another asset bubble?
Well, it's something we are keenly aware of, and we're trying to keep our eyes wide open in terms of what's happening to housing prices, what's happening to commercial real estate, to see, are there signs of bubbles in the economy? These bubbles are incredibly hard to know until they burst, unfortunately. And the problem we have is that the tools we have to quash a bubble are incredibly blunt and incredibly painful. So I'll give you an example. Go back in time. So 2004, 2005, I know it's a long time ago, 12 years ago, we had home prices that were climbing pretty fast, but nobody was sure if it was a bubble or not. And many Americans were participating in the American dream. For the first time in their lives, they now were in a position to buy a house. They could get a mortgage, they could buy a house. Young families, minority groups, everybody was celebrating this. Not just realtors, members of Congress were saying, this is great, our constituents are finally participating in the American dream. The tough thing is for a regulator, like the Fed, to say, hey, we know better than all of you. This is a bubble, you don't know it. Not only do we believe it's a bubble, we're going to quash it. And that's very difficult. Now, I'm not saying the Fed should not have tried, but I am humble to admit this is a very, very tough thing to say we know better than everybody else that this is a problem. I'll give you an example, especially for something like home prices, which for 100 years they'd never fallen. So imagine if I came to you and said, hey, we have to raise rates because I know that the sun is not going to go up tomorrow, and we need to raise rates to protect. You all would say, he's crazy. Right? The sun goes up every day. It's gone on that for all of human history, right? But I'm saying, no, I know better than you. And I'm going to, not only do I know better than you, I'm going to crush the economy. I'm so confident of that. It's a very, very tough thing to be the one wise person when the nation is otherwise deluded. Again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. That doesn't mean we shouldn't keep our eyes open. But I am humble about our ability to have the confidence to quash bubbles before we know they're bubbles.
Well, we have about 20 minutes left, something like that, so I'm going to end our questions. And if you have questions, now's the time to step up to either side of the mic, and we will just sort of rotate and take those. So come on up. We'll start over here first.
Hi, my name is Elias. I just want to take issue real quick with how you said the Fed was created by Congress. Historically speaking, that's just not accurate. I mean, the Fed was invented by a bunch of bankers on an island and then given to Congress and then established afterwards. So I don't know how you can say the Fed received a mandate from Congress when it was created by a bunch of bankers to begin with. I want to know why you would purposely
misled you.
present that to us.
Sure.
And then on top of that,
Could you make sure you speak into the mic so folks on the
Sure.
live stream can hear you?
And then on top of that, if you want to say max participation in the labor force is weighed by a percentage number, but then you point very rightly to this idea that we have a whole bunch of Americans not even in the labor force, why do we not count them as unemployed? When we know for a fact, like by last tally of those numbers, that's 94 million Americans not participating in the labor force. So I'm just curious, it just seems like, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, it just seems like spin.
Sure. Well, thanks for asking it. And I said ask tough questions. First of all, let's go back to the founding of the central bank. So the Congress in 1913 passed the Federal Reserve Act, which created the Federal Reserve. And if you go back in history, America, we had a central bank originally in the 1800s. Alexander Hamilton created the first central bank. It was then disbanded. Other countries have had central banks back for a long, long time, hundreds of years. The Bank of England goes back several hundred years. The reason that Congress ultimately decided to create a central bank is because our economy kept getting hit with financial shocks and repeated depressions. And there were these boom and bust cycles in the economy. If you look back in the 1800s, all of these boom and bust cycles that kept devastating the US economy. And so politicians and the people said, we have to have some kind of a stabilizing force. What do other countries do that aren't experiencing these big swings? They have a central bank. That's ultimately what motivated Congress to create the Federal Reserve. So Congress did pass the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, which created the Federal Reserve System, which did create the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, one thing that's different about our bank is that because our country has had a real resistance to having a central bank, they didn't like all that power concentrated in Washington, D.C., they said, we're going to do something different, and we're going to have our power distributed across the country. So the reason I'm here, the reason there's a Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, is Congress said we want some of the power in Washington, that's the Federal Reserve Board, but then we're going to create 12 regional Federal Reserve banks that are going to be voting members at different times to balance the power in Washington. So literally the reason the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis is here is because in 1913 Congress said we don't want the power concentrated in Washington, D.C. or New York. So that's number one, your first question. Second question, I agree with you. We look at a lot of different unemployment metrics to understand what is the true state of the labor market. Before the financial crisis, the headline rate, which is around 5%, was a pretty good metric because there are some people who are in school who aren't going to be counted in the labor force, full-time students. There are people who are retired, not going to be counted in the labor force. There's some people who are, let's say, a stay-at-home parent, not counted in the labor force. Those are all legitimate reasons why they're not in the labor force. And historically, that headline unemployment rate number was a pretty good proxy for all of those decisions that people have made. Coming out of the financial crisis, it's much more complex for the reasons that you highlighted and that I highlighted. So we actually look at many different measurements of unemployment to figure out what is the true health of the labor market. We look at wages, we look at, it's called U6 is the technical number, which looks at how many people have left the labor force that we think might want to come back in. So I'm with you. I'm not trying to spin you. This is a very complicated topic, and there's no perfect one measure that we can look at, so we look at a lot of different measures.
May I have one more, please?
Sure.
My final question is, you said that no one saw this bubble coming that was the financial crisis or the housing crash. When you had both Chicago and Austrian economists who were saying on the mountaintops for several years that the laws that we had in place to give high-risk mortgages to people who couldn't afford them were establishing a bubble in the housing market. So how do you answer that?
Sure. If you were, imagine that you worked at the CIA and every day you're getting tips from people saying another strike is coming, another terrorist attack is coming, another terrorist attack is coming. Unfortunately, eventually a terrorist attack will come, and then you'll look back and say, wow, in this 1,000 pages of tips that we had, it was somewhere buried in there. There's always someone who is making these kinds of claims at any given point in time. What I'm telling you is there was no consensus in 2004, 2005 that there was a housing bubble. It's very uncertain, and it's easy to see these things in hindsight. It's very easy to say now, hey, we saw it coming, when in fact most people didn't see it coming.
All right. Hi, Neil. My name is Paul Winghart. I'm an instructor here at Bethel. And I do want to thank you. I hope my students have been, they should all be here. I hope you've heard him a couple times mention. I tell my students, back in the 70s and 80s, it was free to criticize the government and the Federal Reserve, but you always heard kind of a reference from, especially from the older generation, that was, it's not perfect, but it's the best. And then you mentioned that almost a couple times in your speech. And I appreciate that because I do believe that's exactly what the Federal Reserve is. It's not perfect, but it is the best. And I applaud your efforts to make the best better, because that's a difficult thing to do. I mean, it's one thing to take something that's perennial bad and make it even mediocre, say like making the Cleveland Browns a 500 team, That's easier to do.
I'm a lifelong Cleveland Browns fan. I don't know if you knew that.
But anyway,
hitting a little close to home.
But what I did it on purpose. What I want to get to real quick, though, is, because I got a line behind me, but the idea of the narrative behind the financial crisis is this. We had the dropping of the Glass-Steagall in 2000, then we had kind of the supermarket of the financial industry, a little bit of a nod here to the dot-com and the PG&E and the SoCal Edison, but then all of a sudden everything picks up in 2007. But a date for me always rang true as a interest rate strategist, and that was February 16th of 2005. You had mentioned this gentleman, Alan Greenspan, came to Congress, and he basically said I had a conundrum. And the long and the short of it, and the reason I want to ask you this question is because you are an engineer, there's some physics behind this, is that he's raising short-term interest rates, 24-hour rate. The one-year forward rates are moving higher, but for the first time in the history of finance, we had actually long rates coming down. So my question to you is, does anybody, and they basically kind of went away from the conundrum after that, and then in 2006, the yield curve inverted, and then 2007. My question to you then is, does anybody explore the conundrum anymore, and do you have a opinion on what caused the conundrum of 2005?
Sure. Well, I don't think a lot of people think about it. A lot of people are analyzing it, but it's not just. I don't think it's over. Why are rates where they are today? Mm-hmm. Right? We've seen people also give the Fed and central banks too much credit, which is interest rates for the last 30 years have gradually fallen since around 1980 through that period and to today, all around the world, in the US, in Europe, in Japan. We don't exactly know why that is. We think it's in part demographics. We think it's things like productivity and technology development. But that all is part of the story of why rates are where they are. The fact that they're negative in Japan, negative in many cases in Europe. And so part of me, I wrote an essay about this, related to this a few weeks ago on our website, where I called it non-monetary problems. And in some sense, I feel like we are trying to solve fundamental challenges in our economy, like demographics, with monetary policy. You can't solve a demographic problem with monetary policy. And so people do look at it, just related to this, why has the recovery been so slow? This is a very fundamental question that the economics profession does not have a good answer for. But a lot of people, including at the Minneapolis Fed, across the Fed, are really trying to understand these issues. So nobody's given up because it's very related to what we're experiencing today. And we all want to get to a higher growth path economy. We want to get to an economy that can support higher interest rates, more normal interest rates, but we're not there yet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Neel, this is Leo Gabriel, professor here at Bethel. I want to applaud you for identifying yourself as a public servant. It's apparent to me in the things you've done so far as president of the Federal Reserve Bank that you take that seriously. I really appreciate your spirit of humility and your listening to communities of color. You're visiting communities of color, and it's just outstanding for a Federal Reserve Bank president to do some of the things that I've seen you do so far in this particular district. Here's my question. You said that this public service has been a part of you throughout your life. And did you carry this part of you into the private sector when you're working with Goldman Sachs and other corporations? And how did that manifest itself? And then secondly, would you suggest to students who are going into the business world that this attitude of being somehow a servant, a public servant, would you suggest that that's a norm or that's a good thing? And how could they do that as they go into the workplace? How could they carry
Yeah,
themselves as a public servant?
So I confess, I don't think I did. I mean, I carried it with me in spirit. It was always an interest of mine throughout my life, but I don't think I expressed it when I was in the private sector because, you noted, I'm pretty intense. And when I do something, I go all in. I do it fully, which doesn't leave a lot of time for other things. So when I was working at Goldman or at PIMCO or as an engineer, that was all consuming what I was doing. Even in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, okay, I do want to find a way to get into public service. And so I was not finding a way to carve out time to do it while I was working in the private sector. For me, it has to be all or nothing. And that's just the way I'm wired. But I do think, look, everybody needs to find their own path. And what's worked for me and what's been motivating for me and rewarding for me is different. Everybody's different. What motivates me is I want to do something that's both challenging and what I consider to be important. It has to be both challenging and important for me to find real fulfillment. And public service, the policy challenges we face as a country that we've been talking about today are really important and they're really challenging. And so they're fun for me to get to apply myself. But I would strongly encourage you, if you want to pursue your public service, whether it's working at a nonprofit or working in government or working exploring these types of issues in a think tank or a policy body, by all means, you should absolutely do it. And again, life is long. It's not as though you make this choice now and that means you're shutting doors in the future.
Thank you.
So my understanding is that you chose to live on the streets for roughly a week. What was the most influential thing that you experienced or learned throughout that process?
Sure. So when I was running for governor of California, I was running on the same issues we're talking about, which is my slogan was jobs and education, that's it. Because my view was if we could fix the schools and create good job opportunities, most of the other problems in society more or less take care of themselves. Now, California has the highest poverty rate in America once you adjust for the high cost of living. And so I wanted to experience the challenges that many Californians were facing. So I went to Fresno, which was the highest unemployment city in the state, and I lived homeless for 7 days. It was like I was trying to get a job. I was going to go undercover and try to get a job washing dishes or packing boxes or cleaning a store just to see if I could live on minimum wage. Well, I couldn't even get a job. So I lived homeless for 7 days, and the only way I got through it was that after a couple days, I had no money left. True homeless people helped me, and they said, oh, you can turn to this shelter down the street, and you can get free meals there, which was a lifesaver. So I was able to go there for food. But that meant that my job search got much harder. I didn't predict any of this. It meant that I could only search for a job where I could walk and back in time for my next meal. So my job search, instead of being the whole city, was now a corner of the city where I could walk to and from. And it was very clear that I was not going to find a job. There were just no jobs in that area. And so it taught me, it reinforced for me the power of a job and how powerful it is in solving so many other problems. And when people fall off the path or fall off the system, so to speak, it can be very hard to get back on your feet because just the simple fact of, okay, where do I sleep? Where do I get food? Okay, now I've gotten food, but now there are no jobs here. How do I get to where there are jobs? It became very, very difficult. And so I'm glad I did it. It was tough. It was literally 7 days living on a park bench, sleeping on a park bench or in an alley, et cetera.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on Rand Paul's audit the Fed bill. So should there be more transparency within the Fed, and does Congress have a right to comprehensively audit the Federal Reserve?
So there's a ton of transparency with the Fed. So the Fed is audited every year. All of our financial transactions are audited. All of the data is published on the Fed's website. There are annual reports that are published. All of the economic transactions are fully audited by the Fed. So this is a misnomer that it's not audited. The one piece that is not audited are the monetary policy deliberations that I have and that my colleagues have around the table. There's a transcript of those deliberations, and that transcript is released after 5 years, and minutes are published after a couple months. The reason there's that delay is that Congress created the system, is trying to protect the Fed from short-term political pressures so that we can deliberate about what do we objectively think the data is telling us, what do we think is the right thing for the economy, and we can ignore politics. And the fear is if you did this, full real-time transparency, that you'll have political influence because people are going to be speaking, worrying about what people at home are going to be thinking as we're having these deliberations. And let me give you an example. The Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is isolated. There's no transcripts of the conversations that Supreme Court justices have with each other. The only thing that is public are the public hearings and then the rulings that they issue, the opinions that they issue. All of their deliberations are private. They're private to try to shield them from any form of political influence. And so I understand people are concerned, but I can tell you this, I'm very proud of how the Fed operates. When I sit there in the room and all of us have our deliberations, I can tell you with a straight face, with my hand on my heart, that I've never seen anybody talk about politics. I legitimately think people are looking at the data, trying to do the right thing for the country, and I don't want to screw that up.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. So we have social issues and distress all over the country right now, where people are speaking out and voicing opinions, demanding change, and yet politicians are hearing them and doing nothing. So what makes you believe that you publishing this paper is going to have the public support in order to invoke change?
Well, I've been really pleased that once I came out with the initiative and I announced in February, the response that we've received has been very strong and very positive and very supported and totally bipartisan. In this first week that we announced this, we had very conservative, right-leaning think tanks coming out saying this is great that Minneapolis is doing this, and we had Senator Sanders. So if we have the far right and the far left saying this is a really good thing, I think that's a great place to start, that there is a lot of interest across the country, across the political spectrum to deal with the too big to fail issue. So that's number one. Number two, as we were saying earlier, I actually do think members of Congress are listening to their constituents. But the fact of the matter is, as a country, we're divided on many issues. And that's why Congress seems dysfunctional, they can't agree. That's because the American people don't agree. And they're listening to their constituents. And so, again, these things look very difficult. Nothing happens until everything happens, and things can then move very quickly. And so the key is, my message to all of you is, you got to vote. You got to make your voice heard through your local leaders, through your congressional leaders, through the national elections. You all, the public needs to be engaged as much as possible, and I think that we can make changes across too big to fail in any range of issues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Mitchell Crum. I'm a professor of political science here at the university. And one of the things that first of all, I've appreciated your talk and all of the comments. This has been very interesting and informative. I'm wondering if you could comment on the relationship you've obviously spoken and written on Too Big to Fail. And recently, Elizabeth Warren and a number of other senators were questioning the Wells Fargo chairperson for his alleged fraud. And I'm wondering if you could comment on the relationship perhaps of Too Big to Fail to the potential for fraud, and perhaps talk about the Fed's role in reining in the potentially ongoing fraud on Wall Street that may be present.
Yeah, so what I know of the Wells Fargo issue is, because the Minneapolis Fed is not the regulator of Wells Fargo, so all I know of it is what I've read in the press and watching those hearings. So there's a concept of too big to manage. I actually don't think this is an example of too big to manage. I'll tell you why. As CEO of the Minneapolis Fed, I worry about those problems or those mistakes that are buried in the organization that may be happening and I'm unaware of. Guess what? The CEO and the board of directors of Wells Fargo were aware of this for 4 years. So this is not an example of too big to manage. This is an example of managers making wrong decisions. And so I don't think that the size of the bank, if they didn't know about this was just in the corner and they were shocked when they found out about it and then they addressed it, then okay, maybe they're too big to manage because the chain of command didn't work. This is just bad management all the way up to the top, making the wrong decisions when they had the information in front of them. And so I think we have to keep our eyes open about the too big to manage issue. It certainly is possible. Big companies make mistakes. Think about every time an airline company, or aircraft company, whether Boeing or Airbus, they announce a new plane. You can be darn sure that plane is going to be billions of dollars over budget and years late. All right, it is really complicated to build a new aircraft. In some sense, they're too big to manage. Now the problem is, when it comes to big banks and they've got taxpayer resources and they've got insured deposits and they can do much broader damage to the U.S. economy, the downsides of those mistakes can be much, much larger. And so I do think it's an issue, and I do think we have to keep our eyes open for it. And I hope that through our Too Big to Fail initiative, maybe it can help with some of these issues too. Thanks.
I'm going to have to draw us to a close so that I respect your time for classes and respect your time for coming. So I want to say thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.
Coming.
Really appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.